the wings, you guys, I gotta tell you, these are probably the most fun part of this design to stitch. And I'm gonna try to explain as I go along, if I can, hopefully I can remember, to explain not just what stitch I'm doing, but why I chose it, and maybe why I chose two strands versus three strands. I see a lot of questions from people who are just starting out that are, wanting to work on their own designs, and it's like, I don't know which, not just which stitch to use, but how many strands, and why would you use one stitch over another, and what are some of the reasons behind your choices. So I'm going to try to remember to explain that kind of thing as I go along, and why you stitch one thing before another thing perhaps. But let's start with the outline of the wings. And if you look over here, this side is all obviously done. And I am going to do the outline of the wings first. The reason I'm going to do that is first of all, I have to put an outline because I need to cover the raw edge of this fabric. Even though it's ironed down and it's very secure, I don't really want that raw edge to show. So I want to put a decorative stitch along all of it. I'm going to do it first before I do any of the interior stitching because it probably is not that big of a deal, but right here, like some of these places over here or along in here, I want to go ahead and get that stitch there laid down so that when I'm stitching right up close to it, like let's look over here. I wanted to have this one done first so that when I do these little leaves, I know, to stay out of the way of that stitching. Again, that's probably not really that important of a consideration, but that's just kind of where my brain went when I was trying to figure out what to do first. And I am going to be, like I said, doing the chain stitch. This is 3 strands of thread. I'm going to use 3 strands, but different colors for the top edge of the top wing, the bottom edge of the top wing, and then the whole interior pink wing here. So let's start with the chain stitch. And, there's 2 ways to do chain stitch. There's what I call the traditional way, and then there's the reverse chain stitch. And lots of people love the reverse chain stitch. I just cannot seem to get comfortable with it. I feel like to me it's working like I'm walking backwards, and it's like I can't ever figure out which direction I want to go when I'm doing the reverse chain stitch. So I just stick with the regular traditional chain stitch, which, as I'm doing, uh, you make a loop, and before you tighten the loop, you bring the thread up inside the loop. So I've come up, I'm going to go down, I'm going to make a loop, but before I close that loop up, I'm going to leave it open. Oh, sorry, trying to get my hands out of the way. Like that, and then I come up inside the loop. I tend to make my chain stitches really pretty small. It's a different look to make each stitch really long and thin. It's definitely works in some places, but I really want to cover this edge, so I'm making them fairly small. So anyway, you pull the thread up and you pull until it's tight. The thing to keep in mind when you're working along here is that you really want to you want half the stitch to cover the purple fabric and the blue fabric, and you want half the stitch to be on the outside so that you're really truly sort of almost like sealing that raw edge of fabric. And that is one reason I chose the chain stitch, because has a little bit of width to it. I could have just put like a back stitch on here, or a whipped back stitch or something, but it would have been a very thin line, and I really needed a stitch that covered both halves, that covered this side and this side of this line. So I didn't want a really narrow stitch, like like you have like a whipped back stitch over here. I needed a wider line. But that being said about the reverse chain stitch versus traditional, if you prefer reverse chain stitch, this is a perfect place to do it. Sometimes I don't like to do the reverse chain stitch when I'm doing rows of chain stitch that are really close together, because it's kind of hard to get your needle under that little loop. But this, since it's just one line of chain stitch, it's a perfect place to do the reverse chain stitch if that is your preference. So it doesn't, it looks the same. I just tend to always choose to do the traditional. So hopefully when you ironed this fabric down, these edges are nice and secure. But if they're not, just be careful when you bring the needle up right along that raw fabric edge, like right here. When I come up, I'm bringing that needle up just right on the raw fabric. If you come up a little bit inside the fabric, and like later on when we're going to be stitching down here, that bit of fabric might sort of lift up. Just carefully hold it with your other finger so you don't just push it off the fabric. But hopefully when you ironed it down with the Wonder Under, you really got those edges sealed. So that's all there is for this section, is just... Oh, I will say one other thing about the chain stitch. Usually I am more comfortable and I'm more, my stitches come out more even because the tension is the same if I work a chain stitch away from myself. So normally I would turn this hoop around and work, let me see if I can show you. Normally I like to work, whoops, gotta get that thread out of there. Working away from me. Because for some reason I find it easier to get a more consistent tension when I am, plus it's just the way I hold the thread, it's just easier to keep them out of my way. When I am doing this part right here, when I am pulling this thread up, there's something about pulling it a little bit away. If I pull it straight up, like just straight up, like if I was coming right towards the camera, the little loop, the tension on the loop is weird. But if I pull it this way, of course that one decided to be all wonky, one thread, there, I just pulled one thread. When I'm doing stitch after stitch, when I'm pulling it this direction, that way, the tension on each little loop seems to be consistent for me. So as I work, I like to work away and I will rotate my hoop as I go around. So that is the chain stitch. Simple stitch, but really effective. Let me go stitch all of these wings. Outlines are done. And now here is the part where I tell you, as much as you want to go ahead and start doing the beading because it's super fun and pretty, let's hold off on that because especially these little the little individual beads we're going to put on, if you do the beading first and then all this other stitching, it's really easy for your threads to get caught on those little individual beads as you're pulling it through, and it's a big hassle. You get like one strand caught and the others don't, and then your thread's all messed up. So I know you want to start on the beading, I do too, but let's get a couple of other things stitched on the wings first before we skip to the beading. So with that said, we are going to do the green stitching along the outside edge of this top wing first. I am using 2 strands of the bright green thread, 166. And the reason I am using 2 strands is because I don't want to completely cover up this pretty purpley blue fabric that we painted earlier. So I want a little bit of that to show through. And if I had used 3 strands for the stitching I'm about to do, it might have just been so close together that those 3 strands are just, I know it's just 1 strand difference, 2 and 3 strands, 2 versus 3, but I just wanted to make sure that some of that blue purple showed through underneath the green stitching. And that's also the reason I chose the stitches I did. They give it a nice clear line, but they're not bulky, kind of like the chain stitch is down here. I wouldn't do chain stitch here because it would just really cover up a lot of that blue purple fabric that we worked so hard to paint, and I didn't want to do that. So now let's work on this bar, this kind of scalloped bar of green down here. And let me pull this over and show you. So this is what we're doing, right? This section right here. And we're going to start with these little lines that run this way across. I'm going to do those first, and then I'm going to do the outline of that bar second. And again, the reason is because of what's in front of and what's behind and what's easier to stitch um, without splitting threads. I don't want to split I mean, I could do the outline first, but I don't want to have to come up and do the little lines going this way without and worry so much about having to split the outline that I'd already put down first. So if I do the interior and then outline it, that makes it a little bit easier. So let's start, and I don't have those little lines drawn on here. What I did to kind of guesstimate what how far apart to put them, I started with each line right here at the point of the scallop. So I'm going to come up at the bottom and go down at that point. And I want all of these lines to sort of angle towards, all up this direction. So I'm going to put that one down, and then I'm going to skip back here, and I'm going to put one halfway. I think that's halfway, almost close, but okay, halfway between the first stitch and the edge, or in other words, the center of this scallop. And now I'm going to put 2 stitches on this side and 2 stitches on this side. I think that's what I did on the other side. That might be a little far away. You could come, I mean, I'm a person who loves to have my pattern lines drawn, and you could sketch in these little lines. One reason I didn't do that is these 2 strands are kind of thin, and if that black line is under there, I would have to, be trying to make sure it was covered. And I just didn't want to have anything else that would, obliterate more of that pretty blue fabric that we painted. So that is that scallop. So now I'm going to come to this scallop, and I'm going to jump over here and do this point, and then come to the center between here and here. Kind of line it up with that dot right there. And now I will come to either side, and I'll put 2 over here and 2 over here. And you could always just make these straight across without worrying so much about halfway and 2 on either side and centering it. You could just, just make the stitches across. And if they're not perfectly even, hey, that's fine too. So we've got one more kind of actual scallop to do. And if it's, like satin stitch, where you're coming up and going down, yeah, you want to come up and go down on the lines, but we're going to be covering those ends of those stitches. So if they're not perfect, that's fine. We're going to totally be covering those with what we're about to do in just a second. Like, see, that one was a little bit short, but it's not going to matter because it's going to be covered up. All right, and then once we get to this section, there's really no center really. So I'm just going to go across and just kind of sort of try to match the distance that they were previously. So just I'm going to work my way from right to left and just go across here. Those lines are finished, and now we're going to do the outline on the top and the bottom. It's the exact same stitch on the top and the bottom. It is going to be whipped backstitch. I'm still going to be using 2 strands of the bright green, so there's no need to you don't even have to end that thread. You can just use the same thread, assuming you still have enough thread on the needle. and just back stitch all the way across here. I'm going to tuck that stitch under that chain stitch like that. And just back stitch all the way across this line. And then we will do the whipped back stitch so that it's not doesn't look like a dashed line, it looks like a solid line. Because we have all these little short stitches right here. We don't need another, kind of sort of broken line. I want a smooth, solid line. So that's why I went back and whipped this back stitch so that it didn't look like a little choppy line. It looks like one smooth line. I have backstitched both the top edge and the bottom edge, and you can see that my backstitch is not very perfect, right? It's just kind of a little wonky. And as easy as backstitch is, and as much as it is one of the most basic stitches in embroidery, it's really, let's be honest, it's really not the easiest to make it look perfect, because just something about all those little lines, trying to get them all lined up at the same angle and coming in and out at the same exact place. It's not that easy. So if your backstitch is wonky, it's not you. It's me too, because something about backstitch. But that is what is good about whipped backstitch, because what we're going to do now when we, whip it, is that, whip it good. Did you get that reference? Is we're going to sort of cover up all of that wonkiness by spiraling this thread around. So I just came back up at one end, and now I'm going to go around and around, go under each stitch, pull that thread out of the way. I kind of always hold it. Doesn't matter if you spiral from left to right or right to left, doesn't matter. You're just going to go around each stitch, go under each stitch. Don't catch any other threads as you go. So be a little careful with this, but it's super simple. Like I said, it really hides all of that back stitch weirdness. So yay for whipped back stitch, right? Let's do the French knots next, since we're down in this area. And I thought about trying to keep the French knots to a minimum on this piece, because some people just don't love French knots and some people love them, but they can sometimes be a little elusive. So if you already know how to do French knots and they're a breeze for you, you can just skip this part. But let me give you a few little tips about French knots if they are one of those things that give you trouble. Let me start out by saying I'm using 3 strands of the bright green thread now, because I wanted a little bit of bulk for the French knots. But the thing about French knots is you can adjust the size of them depending on how many strands you use and how many times you wrap the needle. So you can have all these different combinations. You can have 2 strands but wrap it twice, or you can have 2 strands but wrap it 4 times. Honestly, I don't really do a whole lot of 2-stranded French knots. I tend to do 3. But say you could do 3 strands and wrap it once and have a smaller knot. You can do 3 strands and wrap it 3 times and have a much larger knot. So that's what's one of the many things that's cool about French knots, is you can adjust the size. But here I'm using 3 strands. I'm going to wrap it once. And again, I did not mark these dots, but I am using the scallops as a guide. So I put this one halfway between and this one right at the point of the scallop. I'm going to put the next one exactly halfway between this point and this point. So I'm going to come up right there. And then the thing about French knots, it's really all about the tension. So I'm going to hold it with the other hand and I'm going to wrap it. And I wrap away and some people wrap towards you. It doesn't really matter. I would just say be consistent so that they all look similar, but it works either way. But I tend to wrap away, so I'm going to wrap 1 time. If I was wrapping twice, I'd go 1, 2, but I'm only wrapping once. So 1 time, I'm going to hold it so that the thread is a little bit loose on my needle. And now I'm going to put the needle down, but I'm not going to put it down in exactly the same hole, because if I do that, the knot could just be pulled right through to the back. And I want it to stay obviously on top of the fabric. So I am going to, you know what, I'm going to zoom in a little bit for you. Sure if that was very much, that would help, but anyway, so I'm going to wrap it. I'm going to put the needle down right next to where it came out of the fabric before, and I'm kind of holding that thread back with this hand so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm going to put the needle down and I'm going to hold it up straight. I know it's a little hard to see, but now I'm going to slide that other thread down the needle. Can you see that? I'm going to very gently just slide that little wrap, that knot, down towards the fabric. And now I'm going to put keep just a little bit of tension with this hand. If I just let it be loose like that, you just don't have quite as much control over it as the needle and thread goes down through the fabric. So I'm just going to keep a little tiny bit of tension. I'm not going to pull it so hard that the wrap is just choking that needle, because I won't be able to get the needle down. Just a tiny bit of tension. I'm going to keep my finger right there, and now I'm going to go straight down. All right, and I'm going to pull it through, and as I pull it through, I'm going to keep my finger right there to keep it from twisting on itself. And now I can let go, and now I have a perfect little knot. So let me do that again. Now I'm going to come up right here at this point of the scallop. You don't have to go that slow when you pull the thread. You want to maybe be a little careful so the thread doesn't twist on itself, but I was just going really slow. So here's one wrap. Put the needle down next to where it came up. Slide that wrap down to the fabric. Hold a little bit of tension right there. Don't choke the needle with the thread, just a little bit. Pull that through. Keep your finger on it till the end, and then there you go. What can happen, I mean, you can do French knots much faster than that, but sometimes if you go too fast, the thread twists as it pulls through the knot, and you end up with a knot before you get the French knot done, and that's so frustrating if that's ever happened to you, because you just got to take the whole thing out. Rarely is there saving a French knot, but see, me keeping my finger on it is keeping that twisted thread from forming a knot. So the main mistake that I think people generally make with French knots is that when they wrap it too tightly. They're just pulling like crazy, and they then, especially the more wraps you do, if you do like 3 wraps and you've wrapped that needle so tightly, when you try to put it down in the fabric and pull it through, you just can't even get the needle through. So you want it to be snug up against the needle, but not choking it. When you put the needle down, slide it towards the fabric and pull it through. So I'll just finish these up. I think there's 2 more to go. And oh, see, actually something happened there. That knot see how much bigger those are than that one? I don't know what happened there. Maybe I pulled it too hard or something. So I will probably, that's going to bug me. So I'm definitely going to rip these out and start over, because that's like this weird little nubby thing that doesn't look like a knot. I like it to look like a little donut. So unfortunately, I'll probably just rip all of these out because it's one connected thread, and if I snip these out, I'll just have a loose thread back there, and this one will be loose. So I'm going to have to go back and redo all of these, which, kind of sucks, but hey, I want it to look nice because these are like kind of featured right here. So, all right, let me go redo those. Okay, those are much better. They all look the same, like little donuts, like I said. And I don't even know what happened. I think I was working down here and I just pulled the thread too hard on the back and I just yanked that little knot right all the way to the back, sort of. And that can be a problem sometimes when you have a smaller knot. You wouldn't think it would have happened with this double layer of fabric, but anyway, it was a quick fix. So those are all finished and I like the way they look now. Next up are the leaves and the stem up here up here towards the top of the wing. And we're going to, like I said before, we're going to skip the beads down here and we're going to skip this big section of beading and work up here. And these leaves are going to be satin stitched. If you look over here, you can see they're going to be satin stitched, different color on each side, and then I'm going to outline them after they are satin stitched. If you're interested, I just recently posted a very nice lengthy tutorial on my YouTube channel about satin stitching. And so it has lots of great tips and techniques if you want to improve your satin stitching and if you just can't ever seem to get it quite right. A lot of good things in that video. And these are little tiny sections of satin stitching, so it's not like it's an extensive, long, has to be super smooth. But the way we're going to do this is we're going to have each side be worked at an angle. So we're going to pretend like this is the top of the leaf, and the angles are going to work like this on each side. So when I stitch these leaves, I tend to do each leaf the same. In other words, I work in the same direction for each leaf, and that helps me kind of keep my stitching and how they look consistent. It doesn't, you don't really have to do them that way, but when I find I'm doing repeated things like this, if I do them sort of in the same order and in the same way, I find that rhythm and everything just seems to work out a little bit better. You don't have to do yours this way. Find the way that's comfortable for you. But what I do is these are all going to be all going to use 3 strands of thread, and I am going to start on, I always like just look at this one individual leaf. I always tend to start on the left side with considering the top being here, and I start down here at the bottom and I start with the first stitch here at an angle and I work all the way up towards me on this side, and then I will switch colors, and then I'm going to start back up here. I'm going to work back down this side. So let me show you what I'm talking about. The trickiest thing, and it's not even that tricky, is finding your angle. So you're going to start up here. Hopefully you can see that pattern line, and I'm going to go back down to the point. These are really skinny, long leaves. And then now I'm going to jump up that line just a little bit. So you can see, hopefully, that I'm not coming up right next to that stitch. You know, each stitches has to be angled very sharply, so you don't have to put the ends of your stitches right next to each other. They're going to be up the edge, up the line of that edge of that leaf a little bit. But now, so I can get a really good, extreme angle on it, go back down towards the center. Come back up on the edge and go back down on the center line. So each time when I come up on the side, see that's probably at least 1/8 of an inch between where that stitch ahead of it, the previous stitch came up, and where this one's coming up. But that's so that when I lay this stitch down at the angle, it will sit next to it. Satin stitching is so much just about angles. And another good thing about the way I'm doing these is that because they have an outline on them, that outline will hide any sort of, slight variation on the edges where your needle comes up. And the main thing to do on these is just to make sure you're keeping a really nice extreme angle. You could do each side so that the angle is more flat, so that, in other words, each side, the angle of the stitches is like this as opposed to like this more. But I just liked to accentuate that really elongated, skinny nature of these leaves with a very pretty sharp angle, and I make sure I always go down on the center line, because there is not going to be a stitch to cover the center. So where those two colors meet, I want to make sure that there's no blue fabric showing through. So I'm getting up here to the very skinny tip. That's almost just like a straight stitch down the center. So I'm going to make one stitch that pretty much goes straight. Go down to there. Okay, and with satin stitch, I always kind of run my fingernail over it, kind of smooth it out. Let me park this needle somewhere out of the way. And now on this side is going to be orange. Gotta go pull. All right, I've got 3 strands of orange now. And now I just finished up here, and now I'm going to start up here, and I'm going to work back down this way. So I'll come right up next to, that's the spot where you do kind of want to go in, right next to the previous stitch. Making sure that I take the needle down in the center, like I said. And as you are working closer to the top, the tip of the leaf, the stitches are a little closer together. Again, making sure I keep that angle. It's easy for the angle on these to kind of flatten out, which again is not the end of the world. But I always just try to keep in mind that very sharp angle to, don't want to split my thread there. Go back towards the bottom of the leaf. The thing about satin stitch is taking just enough time to find the right place to come up. Sometimes you do have to feel around a little bit. That one maybe needs to be a little bit closer. Right there. And one more long angled stitch, I think, and this one will be done to meet that tip down there. And that leaf is done. So just do the same thing on all of these. Follow the color chart for which color to use, and then we'll come back in just a minute and we will do the outline. The stitch I'm going to use for the outline for these leaves is the split backstitch, and I'm going to use 3 strands. And the reason I chose the split backstitch is that I originally hadn't planned on putting an outline around them, but when I was working on the other side over here, I did them like this and they just looked kind of plain. And I realized they just needed sort of a pop of color, and they just need something to kind of make them stand out a little bit more. So I didn't have a lot of room though, especially if you maybe over here you can see how, see right there, I didn't have a lot of room between where the beads were going to be and the edge of that leaf, and so I couldn't have a real bulky stitch. And so I chose the split back stitch because I like the way it has a little tiny bit of texture to it. It kind of looks like a little bitty chain stitch, which sort of echoes the chain stitch around here, but it's tiny enough that it kind of really stays up there and doesn't create a lot of bulk. So even though I'm using 3 strands, the split back stitch gets kind of compressed when you stitch it, so 3 strands is fine. 2 strands might be just a little too invisible, you know, around, even though the color is bright, it would be a little bit invisible around these satin stitch leaves. So I'm trying to find just the right, there we go. Just needed just the right spot to come up. So I'm going to make one little stitch, come ahead, right along that edge, and then go down inside the stitch I just made. So that's why when I go back, that's the back part, and then the split stitch is the part where you split the stitch you just made. I try to go straight down, and I try to get right in the center of that previous stitch, and I do make my stitches pretty small. You can make them longer, but very often I find that smaller stitches allow you to get more accuracy, particularly on curves, just like almost anything. The tighter the curve, the smaller the stitch you want it to be, so it will really show off those curves. And see how it makes that kind of sort of like fake chain stitch, little itty bitty. And this would be way too tedious to make a little bitty chain stitch like this. That would not be fun. It would be too tedious. But in this, especially in this bright green color, this really adds a nice bright pop of color around these colorful leaves, and it was really just the perfect thing. I had stitched them over on the other side, and I had moved on, and I thought I was done with those, and I came back the next day and I looked at it and I just thought, you know, those just look really plain. Sometimes you have to do that. Sometimes you have to get away from your work a little bit if you just can't figure out what something needs. And if you come back to it the next day, it's like magic. It's like you see stuff you didn't even see the day before. Or the answer is just really clear if you're just trying to work out a problem or figure out what to do. Suddenly, with the next day, it just seems like, oh yeah, of course, that's what I should do, or that's the color I should use, or the stitch. And I'm going to come to the tip, go to the other side, try to maybe split that little stitch a little bit. That line got a little wonky, but I am going to live with that. I'm not going to worry about that right now. I think it'll be fine. Whoa! Alright, I got a crazy kind of knot on the back. Sometimes you pull up more threads than are ready to come up. So sometimes, there we go. I just pulled them back to the back, straightening all those threads on the back, and now I just pull it back through. Fortunately, that didn't turn into a full-blown knot. Don't you hate knots? You're just going along so smoothly, and then bam. Everything comes to a screeching halt. So okay, this is really simple. Just do each of these sleeves in this really simple split backstitch. Those outlines are done, and then the only thing left for this part is the stem down the center, and it is just the whipped backstitch with 3 strands of the dark blue thread number 824. So that's it for this section of the top wing. I mentioned before that we are going to skip over the beading, so we're not going to do this section right now. And on the under wing, or the bottom wing, we are going to just do this little bar right here, this little orange part, and we're going to work on this stem. So the orange bar is just exactly like the green stitching over here, with the lines that go this way and then a whipped back stitch on the top and the bottom. So that's exactly like the green over here. And the stem right here is the whipped back stitch, 3 strands, number 824, just like we did on the section up here on the top wing. So that's exactly the same. For the little leaves on this little sprig of whatever, we're going to use the daisy stitch. And this is a very, very basic stitch, very commonly used stitch. It takes a little bit of finesse. As simple as it is and as basic as it takes just a little bit of finesse. I'm using 3 strands of the lighter blue 826. I did not mark where these little leaves go because sometimes it's hard, if you like draw an actual loop, it's hard to cover that black line up with your stitching, because sometimes these little um, stitches, these little daisies, these little teardrop shapes, don't cover the line. So sometimes I draw them. Sometimes I'll just draw like a little dot where the end will be. But this time I just left it blank. So you really just sort of, I just sort of eye it. You can definitely draw a little indication of where you want each of these leaves to be. But to make the daisy stitch, if you've never made it, you just come up and you go take the thread right back down right where you came up. So go straight down, and then very similar to how we did on the chain stitch over here, we're going to come up inside the loop. And these down here are really little tiny leaves. So come up inside that loop, pull the loop till it forms a little teardrop. Same thing, it's going to form a better loop if you pull the thread this way instead of up or back. You certainly don't want to pull it back because that loop just disappears. So definitely pull it, in the direction of the top of the loop, and then just take the needle back down right outside that loop to hold it in place. I'll skip over to the other side and do the mirror of that. Hold that loop open. Come up inside the loop. Pull it. Go back down to secure the end of the loop. All right, so just go down and just make 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 leaves on each side. And I know obviously this side is all completely done with the beads and everything, so just ignore that for now. There's just a couple of other things we need to do before we start the beading. So even though I've already stitched this side, you're probably going to want to not do the beading just yet. And you'll find that out why specifically, other than the thread catching on your beads. There's one other reason that we will find out about very soon. Let me do one more little leaf. Okay. So now that this little sprig of leaves or a little branch of leaves is finished, you might be thinking, yay, we get to do the beads. Not quite yet. There's one other thing that we need to do first, but I promise it's going to be fun. It's going to be different, and that is going to be the next step we're going to do.